The Outlast series is something that evaded my radar for quite a long time. The first game seemed to come out of nowhere and blew the industry away with its amazing polish for an indie game, and the sequel came along a few years later to similar critical praise. The series has a particular style and feel, but they aren't exactly the same. The first game is extremely claustrophobic, being set in Mount Massive Asylum, whereas the sequel is much more open, letting the player roam forests rather than tight corridors. I finished both of these games for the first time recently, and found myself in a very sour mood with the sequel in particular. I could talk about the game design, the encounters, and generally just the things that I preferred about the original game, but other people have already said a lot of the things that I could say on this topic. Instead, I want to focus on the biggest problem I had with Outlast 2, one that permeates through every moment of the game, making it feel more and more frustrating as it goes on.
Here, let me try a version that can serve as an intro for the whole piece. Tell me when we're good.
Okay, we're good.
Outlast 2 tells two stories that you jump between, with the connection being our protagonist, Blake Langerman. The primary plot, which we'll call Plot A, sees Blake and his wife investigating a cult in the woods after a pregnant woman is found wandering injured into a nearby town. The Jane Doe dies in hospital, and the Langermans see this as a perfect opportunity for a scoop. However, while searching for the cult, there's a blinding white light and their helicopter crashes, leaving them separated and stranded in the woods. Blake then spends the rest of the game searching for Lynn, who is being hunted by the Testament of the New Ezekiel. The leader, Sullivan Knott, claims Lynn will give birth to the Antichrist and that it must be killed in order to save the world. Alternatively, a second faction called the Heretics want Lynn to give birth to the Antichrist, believing it will also bring about the end times. Plot B is told through a series of flashbacks, where Blake revisits his childhood Catholic high school where himself, Lynn, and their friend Jessica met. It's shown in the intro that Blake has some traumatic memories regarding Jessica, and these sequences boil down to being chased around the school while following Jessica's ghost. As I jumped back and forth between these two plots, I was wondering how they could be connected. Blake seems like he could be in his late 20s, early 30s, meaning these school sections must take place around the mid to late 90s, and Temple Gate was founded in the 70s, so maybe there's some connection. Oh, no, okay, not that. Oh, maybe Blake is actually one of the children of the cult, and like the Jane Doe from the intro, his mother escaped and sent him off to be raised somewhere else. Oh, no, that's not it either. The A and B plot do not cross over at any point. Their resolutions are not connected, they share some thematic similarities, but ultimately you could split them off entirely and not much would change. As the game progresses and Blake quickly loses his mind, the transitions between the mountains and the school segments become even crazier. And then it starts raining blood. In the first Outlast, while some insane things did happen, everything happened in reality, because they fit the rules of the universe. In Outlast 2, things happen constantly which are completely impossible, from a woman going from not pregnant to childbirth in one night, to a literal rapture. By the end of Outlast 2, nothing is resolved. Everybody dies, and the world seemingly ends. The B-plot about Jessica never becomes relevant to the main plot, and I was left extremely frustrated. That is the story presented in Outlast 2, but this is when the issue arises. What we see in the game is not the actual story.
I know God doesn't hear dead men, but I expect He answers them.
While a lot of you may not know the term transmedia storytelling, I guarantee you've experienced it. It's essentially a storytelling practice where a single narrative is told across multiple media, with each piece contributing to an aspect of the story. The classic example of this is the Matrix franchise, where you've got 3 movies, but also games to tell stories between the movies, and comics that flesh out the world and some side characters. I wrote an entire thesis on this topic, so I could literally sit here for hours and hours, and that would be traumatic for both me and you. So let's just get into the meat of good transmedia storytelling. The important thing to recognize is that spin-offs do not necessarily make a story transmedia. They need to be connected in some way. A transmedia story succeeds when it does 2 things. Each piece contributes to the greater whole of the narrative, and each piece can stand alone as its own story. This may sound contradictory, but it's quite simple. Transmedia is not about punishing people for not partaking in the wider story. It's about rewarding people who do. Star Wars is another common example when talking about this. If you watch the mainline Star Wars movies, you're shown the entirety of a story. Each trilogy leads into each other in some way, but they all have their own story to tell. However, if you were to delve into the wider Star Wars lore and media, you can gain a greater understanding and context for many of the events. Casual fans who just want to experience the movie get a complete story, while die-hard fans get to sink their teeth even further. It's a win-win situation. Going back to Outlast 2, the reason all of this is important is because it is a transmedia story. But if you had no idea going into it, like me, you will find yourself probably feeling extremely confused and angry. Every unexplained event, every moment that seemed like it was important but was never mentioned again, every complaint you may have about the story is explained by the C-plot, and it's a plot that is only barely touched on in 2 hidden notes in the game. Instead, they released 5 comics and an epilogue for free on their website which explained the connection between the 2 games. So, what is the C-plot of Outlast 2?
He will come born on locust wings, immaculate as a newborn. He will give us his gospel, the sacred words of his teaching.
During the lake segment of the game, the player can find a note which seems out of place. It's not written by a cult member, and it's not one of Sullivan's many Bible passages. Instead, it seems to be written by somebody completely disconnected to the current events. The note mentions towers and subjects, hinting that some experiments may be occurring in the mountains surrounding Temple Gate. Another note written by a member of the cult describes these towers, explaining that once he got close, he began seeing visions and woke up in an entirely different location, unable to find the towers again. These 2 notes don't explain everything, but they prove that something else is happening here. Out of the 105 different recordings and documents in the game, only 2 of them point to anything other than cult shenanigans. The reason this is an issue is because the game expects you to have read the aforementioned comics before having played the game. The comic explains that the Murkoff Corporation, the big bads from the first game, are not only still operating after the events of Whistleblower, but have begun large-scale hypnotic experiments on entire populations. That's right. The entire events of Outlast 2 were a mass hallucination caused by the morphogenic engine. The comic is split into 2 halves. The first 3 issues act as both a prequel and a sequel to the first game, while the second half sets up the events of Outlast 2. The 2 protagonists, Pauline Glick and Paul Marion, are Murkoff employees who specialize in cleaning up any evidence of Murkoff's mistakes, whether that be through disposing of physical evidence or by bribing and threatening witnesses. In my opinion, the comic doesn't do anything particularly egregious in the first half. It's got a lot of fan service but returning favorites from the first game, and explains how they ended up the way they appear in Outlast 1. The issues begin in the second half, as we meet Simon Peacock. Peacock is the man who appears at the very end of Whistleblower, and his life goal seems to be taking down Murkoff by convincing people to leak information. You could argue that Peacock is the current hero of the Outlast universe, as Red Barrel seemingly can't decide whether Miles is alive or dead, and Waylon burned his house down and escaped to an unknown location with his family. Once Peacock meets Paul, he gives him a set of coordinates, explaining that Mount Massive was a pebble in a pond, an experiment on individuals. This is where the real sickness spreads. The coordinates lead to where else but Temple Gate, Arizona, which leads Paul to discovering the Jane Doe, thus setting up the opening of the game. While in Temple Gate, Marion experiences a white flash which sees him reliving his traumatic past, just like Blake. In the final epilogue, which was released months after Outlast 2, Peacock explains how the test in Temple Gate was to see if religion could be a good delivery mechanism for the morphogenic engine, as gods coming to their subjects in dreams is a common event in religious texts. Oh, and just for a laugh, any guesses for why the ending is the way it is? Why the test ended so suddenly, and why Noth claims he can't hear God anymore? Did you guess that the Wall Rider, which was blown up by Murkoff, actually possessed a colony of ants, which then found their way to Temple Gate and chewed on the towers, thus stopping the experiment? 'Cause I wouldn't have fucking guessed that. When you look at Outlast's universe as a whole, it's not a bad story. In fact, I would argue that if I was to make a video summarizing the story in extreme detail, I could make it sound really good. The problem is that it's executed extremely poorly. When you first play Outlast 2, you'll find yourself feeling like the game was missing a huge chunk of context, and when you get that context in the comics, It makes the entire game completely void. Outlast 2 feels like the middle entry in a trilogy. It feels like the grander story of the Outlast universe is setting up for something far greater with the comics, and the story of Temple Gate is literally just a footnote in the storyline. The thing is, stories like this can be good, they can be enjoyable, but they need to have something going for them outside of their connection to the greater whole. The primary story presented in Outlast 2 is just a roller coaster of torture and really exploitative writing. In the end, the villains all die off screen, kill themselves, or are killed off in the most hilarious anticlimactic ways possible. The flashback plot is obvious, it drags itself out way too long, and again it never contributes to the larger narrative. Maybe it's because I'm Irish and I grew up Catholic, but the moment the game started, I knew exactly where it was going with the Jessica story, which made most of the school segments just feel like they were trying really hard to set up a twist that was obvious from the start. The only way Outlast 2 can work as a story is if you have a connection to the characters. In the first game, Miles was a fairly standard silent protagonist, but his notes had a lot of character in them. By the end of the game, I felt bad for Miles because he really felt like he was just in the wrong place at the wrong time, and the sheer torture he goes through is hard to watch at points. With the second game, Blake isn't silent. In fact, he doesn't stop talking, but the game never made me feel any connection with him at all. 80% of his lines are either a dictionary length of curse words or just him screaming Lynn at the top of his lungs. Then you've got the villains, who are barely present or just have such little character and stage presence compared to the juggernauts of the first game. Outlast 2's writing is completely at odds with the rest of Red Barrel's work. The game feels like it was written to be about cults and religion, and then someone else came along and added all the Murkoff shenanigans. They want to set up this transmedia story with all these interconnecting plot lines and shadowy figures, but they forgot to make the game stand on its own. One of the biggest issues people have with transmedia storytelling is audience retention, and it's an understandable flaw. A lot of people just won't go to the effort of seeking out all the different pieces themselves. It's why explained videos and articles are so popular. That is why the pieces need to stand on their own. If 80% of your audience are only going to see the mainline games, then they still need to receive a fulfilling story, and Outlast 2 just doesn't do that, which is really sad, because the first game kind of had the same problem. Vanilla Outlast has an extremely frustrating ending, which was fixed with the release of the Whistleblower DLC 9 months after it was released. Nowadays, these come packaged together in re-releases because it's necessary to get the full experience of the first game. Outlast 2 feels like it needed a Whistleblower, but it got a comic instead. A comic which is more interested in setting up the future events in a story than fleshing out the characters and lore of the current one. When side villains in the first game get more dialogue than your primary antagonist in the second, you know something is wrong. Hell, when characters in the comic are more fleshed out than the story of your game, you've got a problem. Outlast 3 is in development, and it seems like they're setting up the story for some grand showdown between Murkoff and the people who want to shut it down. Or maybe they'll have an unrelated story and just hit us with another "it was a simulation all along" ending. Even when they flesh out the lore of Outlast, 2 will always stick in my mind as a weird black mark on the franchise.
There's nothing there.
Outlast 2 suffers from an identity crisis. It doesn't know what it wants to be, and the writing suffers the worst of it. In the grand scheme of things, Temple Gate's story is irrelevant, but the game takes itself so seriously and tries to convince you it's important. Plot A and B have a number of parallels, things that don't take much reading into to understand what they're going for. Basic cinematography, gameplay moments, even character designs and transitions. And this is without even looking at it from a thematic level. But why? Why do they constantly include images and moments of sexual assaults? Is the story trying to punish Blake for never speaking up about the murder of Jessica? Then you've got the C plot, the real story, which is a zany comic where, once again, an ant colony chews up a radio tower. Is it trying to be a campy buddy cop comic, or an intense exploitation horror story? It takes a lot of effort and skill to make something both completely horrifying while also being entertaining. That's what the first Outlast managed to succeed in. The sequel, on the other hand, is simply a depressing simulator. A game that takes itself so seriously, tries so hard to make you feel grossed out, but never says anything worthwhile about its story. Because, at the end of the day, there's nothing here. No baby, no resolution, and certainly no satisfaction. Thanks for watching. If you've never played Outlast before, then I still highly recommend checking out the series if you're in the mood for some short, scary games. Hopefully you'll be able to tell that I got a new mic, and I have a lot of stuff coming up soon that I hope you'll enjoy. Anyways, if you want to do all that follow stuff and whatever, that's okay, whatever, I don't give a crap. Thanks again, and I will see you all real soon.